Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alicia Brown. I'm very excited to be with you on this Sunday afternoon. It's just now 12 p.m., so I'm going to wait a few more moments to see if we have some people come in. But if not, I will go ahead and get this party started. My session today will be on culturally responsive classroom management practices with a special emphasis on classroom environment. I do have a PowerPoint that I will be presenting um, in addition to my words. So, like I said, I'll probably wait a few more minutes and then I'm going to get started. I do have the chat enabled, so when you log in, please be sure to log onto the chat to interact. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so culturally responsive classroom management strategy with a special emphasis on classroom environment. So, three things that I want us to focus on is our primary objective of the day is we are going to work to create, or I will present an operational definition of what it is I mean when I say culturally responsive, with a particular emphasis on culturally responsive classroom management. Once we go through that, we will discuss some factors that play a role in disproportionate disciplinary practices in our classroom. And I will make the connection between this research as it pertains to culturally responsive classroom management. Then lastly, we will discuss some first week icebreakers as well as some lesson plan ideas that foster a culturally responsive classroom environment. Okay, so before we begin this work, I would like to make the connection between culturally responsive classroom management and social emotional learning. And before we get into that, it's important for us to stop and think about, well, what does social emotional learning mean? What does it look like? Okay, now here is a definition that I've pulled, and I'm just going to read it out loud for us. Social emotional learning, otherwise known as SEL, is the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, as well as feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. Now, the five components of social emotional learning are self awareness, self management, social awareness, relationship management, and responsible decision making. When we think about culturally responsive classroom management practices, the component that goes along best with our particular topic of the day is social awareness. Because as you create a more culturally responsive classroom, you are also creating more social aware students. And as the teacher, you yourself are also becoming more socially aware. So now we get into this concept of culturally responsive. I know that it has become a bit of a buzzword, but it has been something that has been researched as far back as 1994 with the work of Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings. There has been this concept of making sure that we have culturally responsive pedagogy. As time has progressed, that definition has begun to evolve, and now it is more encompassing of classroom management. For anybody that's watching that is not used to the education term, classroom management essentially means how well do you facilitate a classroom learning environment, meaning how well do you deal with behavior? How well do you deal with motivation? How well do you deal with participation? All of that is encompassed in classroom management. So when we look at culturally responsive classroom management and we look at this particular model, I pulled this work from Weinstein, Tomlinson Clark, and Curran. The title is Toward a Conception of Culturally Responsive Classroom Management, and they identify 5 major components. So the first component is recognition of one's own ethnocentrism. And then the second component is knowledge of students' cultural backgrounds. It also entails understanding of the broader social, economic, and political context, as well as the ability and willingness to use culturally appropriate management strategies with a commitment to building caring classrooms. So as opposed to thinking of a nice, cute definition, I prefer this model because it definitely gives the educators at least 5 things that they can do in order to ensure that they are a more culturally responsive teacher. And then it also gives you some concrete ideas of things that you can do to make sure that you have a culturally responsive classroom. Okay, so this is a video that goes into the need for culturally responsive. And essentially, currently in America, we have a bit of a disconnect between the, let's say, what our teachers look like and what our students look like. And currently, we are having a cultural disconnect in the classroom because we have a lot of teachers that do not come from the same background as their students. And so not only does that cause a potential rift in the classroom, it can also cause a potential rift in the outside community, and that the community may feel like educators are coming into their community as opposed to educators being a part of their community. So here is some specific percentages regarding the distribution of students enrolled in public elementary and secondary schools by race and ethnicity. And it focuses on 3 time periods. So 2002, 2012, and 2024. As you can see, the number of white students currently is headed in a downward trend. The number of African American students or Black students seems to be in a downward trend as well. Not as steep as a decline in white students, but there is a decline. However, if we look at our Hispanic student population, there is a definite increase in terms of the amount of Hispanic children that will be entering public and secondary schools. And then we also have our Asian Pacific Islanders, which is in an increase, and then our indigenous, the indigenous population of the Americas, which is staying pretty stagnant. And then we also have our 2 or more races, which is increasing. So now that we've kind of gone through the backdrop of culturally responsive and what it means, and we looked at some numbers that describe our teacher workforce, now let's go into this concept of disproportionate referral and discipline practices. So just to give some background knowledge, this served as the groundwork of my dissertation that I completed last year, in which I studied the overrepresentation of Black students in referral data. I focused specifically on subjective referrals because a lot of the research shows that is, I guess, the largest category of referrals that students receive, regardless of race. That subjective referral is generally the one that is applied. Now, the reason why it is the one that's generally applied the most is because, just to be frank, there is a lot of gray area in those subjective referrals. So anything subjective, that's basically going to be something that you can't see it or hear it with your own eyes, like a fight. That's something that you can readily observe, and you can see that two students are fighting. Things such as tardies. If a tardy is warranted by a referral, that is, denoted by a set timestamp. So those are things that are more so known as subjective. Subjective referrals are those referrals that are categorized as disrespect, are categorized as defiant. Some of those things where it depends on the situation, and then it also depends on the person, because what I deem disrespectful, another person may not deem disrespectful. So there's a lot of gray area. And that's why a lot of referrals tend to get casted in a wide net of the subjective referral data. So here is some data from the department. The Department of Education. They basically have been keeping track of referral data dating back to the 1960s. The purpose was to ensure that all students were being treated fairly in the school system. I'm sure anybody watching this video knows that that is not the case. And so essentially we have years and years and years of data telling us the exact same thing every single year since 1964. And we have yet to really do anything about the data. We have yet to really implement some lasting policies that will make real changes, that will see more proportionate percentages of students as it relates to their referral data and their student population. So just to kind of walk us through this particular visual, the first bar discusses simply enrollment. So just looking at percentages, how many or what percentage of students are enrolled in our public schools. So as we can see, the blue box, which is white, currently represents just about half of all of the student population. And then everything under that is comprised of our so-called minorities or just different ethnic groups that are not white. So we see that 2 or more, that represents about 2%. We see Hispanic Latino is about 24%. We see Black is 16%. We see our Native Hawaiian and or Pacific Islander is 0.5%. We see our Asian population at 5%, and then we see our Native American population at 0.5%. So that's just the enrollment. Now, when we talk about referral data, in a perfect world, the referral data would be very close to the enrollment percentages. So that means white kids would constitute about 50% of the referrals. 2 or more would constitute about 2 to 3. African American would constitute about 16, and that's just generally how that data works. So if we look at in-school suspension, we see that for the most part, your white student enrollment is pretty proportionate to the in-school suspension rate. In fact, it goes down, which ideally, we would like all groups to kind of have some of those numbers. We see that 2 or more, they represent 2% of the enrollment, and then they also represent about 3% of the in-school suspension rates, which again, that is proportionate. That's pretty on for par. We look at Hispanic at 24% enrollment and about 22% of in-school suspension. Just to pause, like I said, for anybody watching that is not from an education background, in-school suspension is when a student receives an exclusionary, basically consequence, but they don't go home, but they essentially kind of go to a room that is on the school's campus, and they don't participate in anything, but they are at school. They still go to lunch. They may not do some of their extracurricular activities, but they are on the school's campus. So that's what in-school suspension means. Okay, so I kind of backed it up. So now let's get back to the numbers. If we look at the enrollment for Black students, the enrollment is about 16%. And then in-school suspension has jumped up to 32%. So it basically doubled. That is disproportionate because the enrollment percentage does not correlate with the in-school suspension rate. And then we see for Native Hawaiian, their rates go down. We see Asian, their rates go down. And we also see for Native American, their rate goes down for in-school suspension. Now, when we get to out-of-school suspension, so that's a single. So that basically means you have the one student isolated event where they happen to get suspended out of school. So when we look at those rates, we see that white students have decreased even more. So they're disproportionate, but they're disproportionate more in a, I guess if you want to say positive way, because fewer of them are getting those referrals. Two or more, there's a slight increase. Hispanic, there's a slight decrease. African American, again, 16%, 33% out of school. So again, in comparison to every other ethnic group, Black kids are 2 times as likely to receive a suspension rate in comparison to their actual enrollment data. And that's pretty much how we read this graph. And if you just kind of follow along 16, 32, 33, 42, that is huge. That Black students are disproportionate. Another group that is also disproportionate is our Native American. Now, we did see a decrease in in-school suspension. However, when we look at out-of-school suspension, that's 0.5% to 2%. That is a huge gain because, again, we're not simply just talking about the number, we're talking about the rate, we're talking about the percentage. So that also is very disproportionate in relation to their enrollment. And then we see with expulsions, it's even more. It goes from 0.5 to 3%. So essentially, my research just really interrogated why this happens, why this continues to happen, and what are some meaningful things that we as educators can do about it. Okay, now I presented this data. This presentation is something that I did in my district. I did it last year. And so I remember the first time I did it and I showed the previous slide, a lot of the educators, they sat there and usually when you're faced with that kind of data, it's hard for you to process. So a lot of them just kind of sat there, kind of stone-faced, kind of puzzled. Some of them seemed, visibly upset, visibly concerned. And I definitely remember in one session, one of the male teachers basically kind of said, well, what good does it do for us to look at, national data? We need the data from our district. And although to the untrained ear, that may come off as just sheer, curiosity, but I knew that it came from a sense of denial. And so a lot of educators like to believe that if something is a national trend, it doesn't apply to them. So that means, well, yeah, I know that's a national trend, but I'm sure our district, I'm sure we don't do that. I'm sure our district, we treat everybody with the amount of equity and equality that they deserve. And so this is why I felt it necessary to include this slide, because a lot of things don't become real until it's with your numbers. So in the particular district that I was presented in, I was able to go in and I was able to pull their student population data. And then I was also able to pull their ISS and their OSS actions from PEAMS. Now, in the state of Texas, PEAMS data is basically the system where you house all of the disciplinary action for all of your students. It's public information. It's just information that a lot of people in the public don't think to look at. So hopefully anybody that's watching this session, you will maybe kind of go do some research, look up the data for the school district that you pay taxes to. I'm not even saying if you have kids or not, just the school district that you pay taxes to. Just kind of go in and take a moment to look at some of their referral data and see if it aligns with their student population data. So I kind of color coded it because I wanted teachers to really be able to see the visual. And the main color that stood out the most to everyone, simply because it grew, is the blue. And when you, I don't think you guys will be able to see it, but the blue is our African American, our Black student population, which the population is only 26%. And yet that particular group represents almost half of the ISS and OSS data. So this is not if something is a national trend, that means 9 times out of 10, it is also occurring in your school district, in your school, possibly even your classroom. So like I said, when I got to this part of the presentation, it definitely got a little bit uncomfortable because a lot of teachers had to kind of sit with the idea that they too could be possibly attributing to this national trend, which is Black students, but Black and Brown, our Native American students, are being disproportionately removed from their educational settings. And now it's time to really think about and really confront why that is. So when we talk about a culturally responsive classroom culture, and if we go back to that definition of recognition of one's own ethnocentrism, that takes a lot of time, that takes a lot of work. But once you get to the point where you can pinpoint your own biases, where you can pinpoint your own privileges, and when you can really think about how these biases and how these privileges act out in your practices, only then can you really get to this point to where you are even developing personal relationships. Because if you're trying to relate to someone that is different from you, in order to develop a real relationship, you really have to dig deep into who that person is. And a lot of times, who they are is defined by their culture. It is defined by where they live. It is defined by who they live with. It's defined by the things that they consume when they are outside of the classroom. And as educators, I know a lot of times we like to be in the world, but not of it. But in order to really understand our students, we've got to break down that wall, and we have to really be of the world. We have to really be of our students' lives that we are trying to reach. So developing personal relationships and also creating caring communities, and really thinking of the classroom as a community and not necessarily a community where you are the president. I know a lot of times when you're in the classroom and you get that rush of power and you get that sense of, well, I am the teacher and it is your job to learn from me. But again, as we lean towards more culturally responsive, you have to shift that into thinking, well, what can we learn from each other? And that means recognizing that you as the teacher, you can learn something from your students. And only then will you really begin to develop a personal relationship. Once you create this sense that students can learn from me and then I can learn from them. So as opposed of a one-way transfer of ideas, it's a two-way transfer of ideas. Okay, the third point, establish business-like learning communities. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to sit in rows, that everybody has to dress a certain way. That's not what they mean when they say business-like. Business-like is more so meaning that you have clear expectations, you have clear goals, and then you have clear objectives that will help students reach said goals. So it just means making sure that everything is in alignment with everything. So every lesson is connected. Every rule is connected. Everything is connected. And everything is business-like because, again, you're adding in those expectations. Now, the part that's kind of italicized and put in red is because I felt like this was something that you don't usually see a whole lot when you talk about, well, how do I create a culturally responsive classroom culture? And so here it says to utilize culturally and ethnically congruent communication processes. So a lot of times I like to use myself as an example. I remember one year when I was in the classroom, that was one of the few times where I had in my opinion, I had a diverse classroom. At the time, I taught in a district that was predominantly, it's like 95% African American. So it was it was a very homogenous group most times. But this particular year, I remember I had a few white students. I still had a majority Black students, but I also had I had some Hispanic students, and I also had I had one Vietnamese student. So for me, honestly, I loved it because I love being able to tie in all of the cultures as we discussed U.S. history. At that time, I taught fifth grade U.S. history and fifth grade science, and so I'll never forget there was one instance I had with one of the students where I noticed they would never look me in the eye, and I remember, you know, in Black culture, not looking someone in the eye when they're speaking to you, that is definitely on grounds of disrespect. And that was one of the things that I maintained in my classroom, is that when we speak to one another, we look each other in the eye. And I remember with this particular student, the reason why they weren't looking me in the eye, it wasn't a form of disrespect. I don't remember how I found out. I think I used to ask a friend of mine, or I was able to have a parent-teacher conference, and the parent explained. But they simply explained that for children in their culture, they don't really look adults in the eye, not as a form of disrespect, but as a form of respect. And, I always think back to that moment in my teacher career, because that's an ethnically congruent communication process that I totally missed out on. And the reason that I missed out on it is because I centered myself in that interaction instead of thinking about, okay, well, instead of me jumping to disrespect, what are some other things that could possibly be at play here? And, that's only come about because of my own understanding and my own growth and what it means to be truly culturally responsive. So, utilizing culturally and ethnically congruent communication processes, those types of things really only come into play when you immerse yourself and when you truly take time to understand a culture. So that means even things as, watching some of the movies, watching some of the TV, watching some of the news, listening to some of the music, listening to how your students talk to one another during recess, during lunch, when they have sidebar conversations, and just really, observing and learning and processing and asking questions when you feel confused, or if you aren't quite sure how to interpret something, just ask them. And that's why that's something that I put in red, because that's the piece that I really feel like as educators we could stand to make a lot of ground in this area. And then the last two, demonstrating assertiveness. In mainstream American culture, we pretty much value being assertive anyway. So teachers a lot of times don't have, this isn't really an area of concern. We kind of naturally do this, as well as utilizing clearly stated and enforced expectations. Again, I'm sure we're all used to the stereotypical classroom where you have the poster that says rules, and then there's like 10 or 11 rules. So we're definitely all about utilizing clearly stated and enforced expectations. The only thing that I would challenge is to think about what are your expectations? What do they look like? Are your expectations always punitive? I remember one year during my classroom, part of my rules was to participate. And I know that's not traditionally something that you would think of as a rule, because most of the times when we think of rules, we think of things that we're telling students not to do. But how about if we think about rules as things that we want students to do? That's how you can kind of think about that concept of expectations, and what you want expectations to look like. And also understanding that you as the teacher should not be the only person to establish expectations. Eventually, we want students to be able to expect things of themselves. So really giving them the autonomy to think about and conceptualize, well, what are some of your expectations for yourself as a student? What are some of your expectations for me as the teacher? And so again, that goes back to as opposed to having a one-way transfer of information and ideas. We're creating a two-way transfer of information and ideas. Okay, and so we live in this particular setting where a lot of what influences students' communication processes, I kind of created a visual, and these are some of the things that I noticed. Just, being in the classroom and interacting with students. A lot of what influences them, is their social media, is their movies, the music, the different celebrities that they're into, their colloquial vernacular, which a lot of that, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this concept of, stan language, all of that, it all kind of converges in the social media. And so with social media, a lot of the students are interacting with cultures that they don't necessarily have access to in their own communities. So a lot of the students have found ways to become, if not more culturally responsive, at least more culturally aware. They're much more aware of cultures. Kind of where we come in as educators is we have to help them navigate this terrain and get them to move beyond simply being aware of someone's culture, but how do we appreciate someone's culture? How do we appreciate differences? How do we understand that differences doesn't necessarily mean bad? So just because, you do something different from the way that I do it doesn't mean that your way is wrong and my way is right. It simply just means that it's different. And so this is something that I utilize to kind of drive the point home with educators that in your free time, you have to immerse yourself in basically some of these places. And that's the best way that you can learn about your students, especially social media and especially the celebrities that they're into. Because like I said, a lot of students, they get into things and they may not want an adult's guidance, but a lot of times they do. A lot of times they do need to understand, well, okay, if this celebrity is doing this thing, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go ahead and do it too. But if we're never in those spaces, we never know what's going on. And so our students are learning all of these things, and they're bringing it to the classroom, and they want to talk about it. But we as educators, if we're not well versed in it, then we can't give them the safe space that they can talk about it. And a lot of these things can be integrated into our lessons. It can be integrated into our overall classroom environment. And so, again, like I said, this just all goes back to that immersive aspect. Are you really taking the time to understand, who your students are when they leave your classroom? Okay, so as we go back and we think about the definition of social emotional learning, and I highlighted that the component of social emotional learning that relates the most to culturally responsive classroom culture is, being socially aware. So my question is, how does fostering a culturally responsive classroom culture create socially aware teachers and students? That is pretty much the big question that I leave everyone with when I do this session. It's just, how can we utilize culturally responsive teaching, culturally responsive classroom management to make students and to make ourselves more culturally aware? Because again, even as it pertains to culturally responsive, I don't want us to walk away from this session thinking that, oh, okay, well, it's my job as teacher to teach students how to be more culturally responsive. No, it's your job as the educator for you to learn how to become more culturally responsive. And then you kind of walk your students through that process. Walk them through the process of what it means when you don't prejudge a situation, when you kind of take a situation at face value, when you take time to contextualize, when you take time to look at the different nuances of how people interact, how people communicate, and you take all of that into play before you make a decision. And that's ultimately what it means to be more culturally responsive. And eventually, we want to be not culturally responsive, but we want to be culturally proactive. So we want to do things ahead of the game. We don't necessarily want to respond to someone's culture. We want to anticipate the culture, and we want to make sure that students and parents feel welcomed, and not feeling like their culture is something that they have to take at the school door. Okay, so that culminates my session. I thank you all for taking the time to either watch this live or possibly watch this, on your own time. I am definitely open to communicate about this particular session, and I'm especially curious to see what other work people do as it relates to culturally responsive outside of the work that I do. Because again, it's getting to the point where now we got to stop talking about the problem. We have to come together and we have to figure out what are some solutions, what are some concrete steps that we can set in place so that the next generation of educators, the next generation of teachers, this is something that is common practice. My email is at the bottom, aliciambrown18@gmail.com, and I am also on Twitter. So please feel free to follow me, to interact with me. I am an open book. I am very new in this work. I just completed my dissertation last year, so I'm definitely hungry, and I'm definitely open to seeing what else is out there, and more importantly, what else are people doing, so that we can hopefully form some connections to where we are all working together. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining me, and I hope you check out some other amazing sessions for the MAD PD conference of 2019. Thank you.